here's Brody Brazil.
You know, a while back, I made a video documenting what I thought were the 5 worst ever professional sports team relocations. And somebody said in the comments section, well, are there actually any good team relocations? To which I thought, probably not. But then I actually realized I think there is such a thing as a good relocation for a professional sports team. And the prime example actually turned out to be the A's when they went from Kansas City to Oakland. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, of course, good relocation because they came to where I was eventually born, and that became my team growing up. It has nothing to do with the A's going to Oakland. Honestly, they could have went from Kansas City to the moon for all I care. But it was what was going on in Kansas City and the fact that Major League Baseball was almost forced into giving Kansas City a brand new team, a fresh slate. That made all of this an actual good relocation. The A's went on to have some success in Oakland, a brand new market, and Kansas City got to keep Major League Baseball. So let's get into how the A's started in Kansas City when they moved out there from Philadelphia in 1955. So only a handful of years in, like 6 years in, the team just moved, and then it got sold to insurance magnate Charles Finley. Charlie Finley bought the A's. He also spent more than $400,000 of his own money to improve the stadium they played in, Municipal Stadium, which also hosted football, which also made him not happy. Now, he tried to get out of that stadium. He tried to get a different lease for that stadium, tried to get his own stadium for the A's. And does this sound a little bit familiar? Like the entire period of the A's in Oakland in sharing a stadium, wanting their own stadium, but not figuring out that situation. But Charlie Finley also did some good things, some positive things for the Kansas City A's. He introduced KC on the hats. They didn't really have that before. And also to put Kansas City on the front of the road jerseys. He really wanted to represent Kansas City. And this was his quote. "My intentions are to keep the A's permanently in Kansas City and build a winning ball club. I have no intention of ever moving the franchise." So basically like rooted in Kansas City, huh? If you know what I mean? And Charlie Finley was also somebody who realized he didn't want his team to be a feeder to the New York Yankees anymore. So he wanted to change the entire landscape and culture of the A's franchise. He wanted to make it its own successful thing and represent Kansas City. But again, there's a lot of turbulence here because Finley did not like the lease, the existing lease in Kansas City for the stadium. He didn't like sharing it. So immediately, he's already having casual conversations and discussions of moving the team. He just bought the team in Kansas City. He's saying it can work here. But by 1961 and 1962, talking to Dallas lightly about maybe moving the baseball team there. In 1964, just a couple years later, Finley signed an agreement to move the team to the Kentucky State Fairgrounds in Louisville. That's right. He was all ready to move this team. He had it signed, sealed, and not delivered, almost delivered, to move the team to Kentucky. They would have been known as the Kentucky Athletics, but they were denied by a vote from fellow American League owners. 9-1 said, no, you cannot move the team to Kentucky. You got to stay in Kansas City. In fact, the commissioner at that point kind of forced Finley into eventually signing a 4-year lease to stay in Kansas City, which was their last lease before they moved out west to Oakland. And even in 1964, there was conversation of trying to get the A's to move to Oakland, but that also was voted down by American League owners. And there was talk of going pretty much everywhere in the following years. Atlanta and Milwaukee and New Orleans and San Diego and Seattle also were considered options as future homes for the A's. And I mean, we're not even a decade into their existence in Kansas City, and all of these years being spent talking about them going other places. Finley also actually considered a cow pasture in Peculiar, Missouri, as a stunt, obviously, of building a stadium, putting up a grandstand and saying, we'll play here. We'll play anywhere else than Kansas City, because he was so frustrated about the stadium situation and the lease situation. And attendance did not really respond well to all of these developments. I'll say developments, but more like threats. We'll move here. We'll go there. We'll talk to every town and city. What do you think the fan base in Kansas City is going to do? How do you think they're going to respond if there is no commitment that they will actually stay in Kansas City? American League President Joe Cronin, he ultimately persuaded Finley to sign that 4-year lease I was telling you about. through the 1967 season, their final season in Kansas City, he finally persuaded Finley to sign that lease. And so Finley had to, and the A's had to live up to it, but eventually that was their final lease. There were some losses and some gains for Kansas City in what happened next. During the 1967 World Series, during the World Series, now you know this doesn't happen anymore in this time and age. Like, you don't announce big news during the World Series and overshadow it, but during the 67 World Series, Finley announced the A's move to Oakland. It came down to either Oakland or Seattle. Turned out, they went to Oakland. October 18th, just about a week or so later, American League owners give him the final approval for the move. And that's how the A's ultimately came west. However, with all of that going on, in the background, there was a push to get a new stadium for baseball and eventually a new stadium for football over at the Truman Sports Complex. Just weeks later, after the A's were approved to move by the American League, voters in Jackson County, near Kansas City, they approved a new stadium bond measure and what would ultimately build Kauffman Stadium, which was completed in 1973, not for the A's, they were long gone by then, but for eventually what would become the Kansas City Royals. Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri, now how did this happen? He threatened to introduce legislation removing baseball's antitrust exemption unless Kansas City was granted an expansion team in the next round of expansion. Baseball responded quickly. Baseball announced 4 new teams like a couple weeks later during the 1967 winter meetings. So we're talking from October to basically December, baseball had to figure this out. They were threatened with this antitrust legislation. And so baseball announced 4 brand new teams. Now, they were in a position to expand back then. Maybe they're not right now. And they also put a team because of this in Seattle. And they also, Symington basically forced baseball's hand to say, oh, no, we're not waiting 3 or 4 more years. You need to do this within the next year. And they did. And they also kind of rushed the franchise in Seattle, which is why the Seattle Pilots lasted, I think, only 1 year before they were forced to move. But it doesn't matter. Kansas City got a team, and Kansas City got to name its own team. Eventually, obviously, as you know, they called them the Royals. So here are my takeaways of all this and why I'm saying this was actually a really good relocation. You had Charles Finley, who at one point said, quote, "This is a horseshit town. No one in Kansas City will ever do any good here." He went from saying, "I promise to never move this team," to that. And so he was a little bit all over the place. I don't know the man, didn't know the man personally. What more can I say? I'm not trying to talk ill about him or the situation, but he was a little unconventional, a little all over the place, a little volatile, so to speak, and wasn't necessarily intent on staying in Kansas City. And the problem is he was wrong. The Royals are a prime example. They have existed for many decades successfully since. They're a good franchise of Major League Baseball. And again, the promises of we'll never move, we're going to stay here, and then a 180. And ultimately, they voted him and allowed him, the American League owners allowed him to move to Oakland. And I'm only saying this is a good relocation. It was a good relocation because Major League Baseball did the right thing for Kansas City. Okay, we're going to let them leave. We're going to get rid of this problem for you. Let them go to Oakland. Let him do what he wants. But you deserve a team. And we're going to let you have a new team and have a fresh slate all at the same time. And they were able to do that because they expanded by 4 teams, including the first 2, Seattle and Kansas City, at the very same time. They had to do them 2 at a time. And that's kind of the frustrating thing here, is that history kind of can't repeat itself right now, can it? Baseball can't just say, well, here's an expansion team or 2, one for Oakland, one for Nashville. I mean, they could do that. Why don't they do that? Do we need somebody to do what Stuart Symington did? Press the issue a little bit? I mean, baseball completely responded to that in the late 60s and gave Kansas City what they wanted, but I just don't know if it's a possibility in this day and age. So, wanted to document something that, in reverse, played out very similar. The A's in Kansas City said they would stay. said they wanted to find a new stadium, said they were going to work it out, said they'll never leave. The A's in Oakland wanted a new stadium, said they were rooted in Oakland. They were going to be the team that never left. And look what happened. I mean, history, in large part, repeated itself, except for the most important part. Kansas City got a new team, and as of right now, that does not look possible for Oakland. You made it here to the end of this video. Thumbs up down below. I greatly appreciate that. Helps me, this video, and this channel. And also go down there and make sure before this ends that you are subscribed to this channel. That way I can definitely see you back here next time.